Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be continuing our Roblox Tycoon game by cleaning up some of our existing code. We'll also be looking to add some general polish and new mechanics to the overall gameplay. So if you've been following the series by watching the previous videos, you'll sort of know that we have a basic Tycoon game. You can sort of stand on buttons to build things and get money that and you can use to build more things. It also sort of works multiplayer because we have that template that gets copied into these things, and different players get assigned a different factory. But as we've been going along, we've sort of been writing this code a bit haphazardly. And we've sort of um, moved some things around, we've copied and pasted things, and we've kind of got into this position where some of our code is not as nice and neat as it could be. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to clean that up. Now, I know some people are adverse to doing such a thing because it takes time away from actually developing the game and doing the fun bit. Um, but I know that we're going to be sort of adding new features to our Tycoon. And the newer the feature is, the more complicated it's going to be. We've done most of the basic stuff. So the next, set of things that we need to add are going to be more complex. And if we start adding complicated code to messy code, it's going to get really kind of hard to understand, which makes it more difficult to then add new features or even to come back and fix some of the bugs that you've accidentally added because the code was sort of messy as you began with. So it's not too bad because we don't really have that much code. But I'm just going to show you some handy things that you can use to either clean up your own code or sort of think about as you're developing in the first place. So if we take a look at this button script, for example, we've got this weird sort of format that we use in this untouched event. We do this technique where at the beginning we check to see if we can find the player that touched us. And if we cannot, then we return early. And this is really good. But then later on, instead of returning early, we do this weird nested if statement, which looks okay and it does mostly work, but it can actually get confusing. And there are some situations where this can lead to problems. So right now, we're trying to get the leader stats from the owner of the factory. That makes sense. And if we find it, then we get the money from the leader stats. And if we find that, we check that we have enough money, which is great. But what happens if, for some bizarre reason, this leader stats doesn't exist? Someone's managed to hack the game or break the game in some way and they don't have a leader stats. What you'd expect to happen is the button not to work, right? That's what you'd hope happen. If someone's trying to break the game, we want the button not to do anything, not to give them infinite things. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So if leader stats is nil for some reason, we can't find it, instead of just returning early, we're going to skip over this entire if statement and we're going to end up buying the thing that the button's attached to anyway, which is not the behavior that we want. So we can sort of clean this up with some guard conditions, similar to the way that we do at the top. So we don't need that comment really because it's kind of obvious what it's doing. We get the player character from the other part, and if it's not there, then we return early. Then we're doing a check to make sure that the player that we just found is the owner of the factory, and if it's not, we return early. We should be doing a similar thing here. So we find the leader stats, and if we cannot find the leader stats for some unknown reason, we should return early. This is a better pattern because if something goes wrong, we don't end up buying the thing that the button's attached to. Instead, we quit, which would be much nicer. So the same thing, if we cannot find the money for the leader stats, we should return early. Right now we're using the same pattern up there, and the similar thing here. If at that point, well, we only need to calculate the cost down here if we've actually gone this far. So now we get the cost, and if the cost is too much, like the money is less than the cost, we should return early. And instead of then using an else statement and having everything indented, now we can just know at this point, all of those guard conditions have been checked and they've passed. So at this point, we are ready to buy the item. And this pattern of sort of checking everything first and returning early is really nice because once you understand what it's checking for, you can sort of ignore everything above that point. And this here is the actual interesting part of the script. Before, we had sort of some returns and some actions within these different pieces, and they were all indented, and it was kind of hard to follow. But now it's a much clearer pattern. You return early if something goes wrong, and by the time you get to the bottom, nothing has gone wrong, so you're ready to do your action. And we can sort of use this pattern throughout our code. So the dropper itself doesn't really do anything in terms of checking. Actually, it does here. So we could use that pattern here. So in the update dropper thing, if it is a not purchased, the dropper was not purchased, then return early. That sort of gets rid of one of those indents. And now you know that once you get here, it's ready to drop the new product, that block that it generates that gives us money. Yep, so that pattern's really cool. And the seller is also similar in terms of us using this leader stats sort of pattern where we indented to find the money. It works a little differently because instead of returning early, we sort of do it inside the conditions. But I think at this point, it would be really interesting to show you some other way that you can sort of refactor your code to make it nice and neat. So this code is doing something very, very similar to find the money that this code was also doing, right? You find the leader stats from the particular player, and if you find that, you find the money, and so on and so on. And we want to copy and paste that code here, really. But instead of copying and pasting and then having two sets of code that are pretty substantial in terms of number of lines of code, and if there's an issue in one of them, like we name the case wrong or we decide to change it, then again, we'd have to change it in multiple places, and I'm against that. So instead, we're going to add a new kind of script. These things are just regular scripts, but you can also choose this thing called a module script. Now, the difference between a module script and a regular script is that when the game starts up, Roblox will look through all the scripts and start running them. Okay? But a module script will not start running on its own. The only way a module script can run some code is if another regular script requires it to work. So require is a keyword, but basically, if a regular script requests a module script, then the module script will be allowed to run. Otherwise, the module script will never do anything on its own. So this is really handy because you can put sort of shared code in here, and then a regular script can sort of request the shared code from there and then run it. So it's a kind of way of sharing code between different scripts. And the way that it works is a module script will always have an object. I guess when you make it, it's called module, but it doesn't really matter its name. And that must get returned from the script. You'll see this isn't wrapped in a function or anything, and we're still using the return keyword. And that's the way module scripts work. So whenever you request this module script, you'll get this table back. So when you want to add something to it, you can do it like this. Module dot, we'll call it get money, which is really what we're doing. And we'll make it equal to a function that takes in the player that you want the money for. And we will do something here to return that money. Okay? So what will we do to get the money? Well, we're just going to copy and paste here. But it's okay because we're going to replace that. So really it goes like this. So to get the money, you pass in the player, and then we find the leader stats from the player. And if we can't find it, we should return early. And let's return nothing in this case. And if you do find the leader stats, you get the money from the leader stats. And if you can't find that, you return nothing. Otherwise, you return the money itself. Okay, so we have this function called getMoney on this module, and the module gets returned from the module script, but no one's using it yet. Let me show you how you can use it. So there's a special keyword in Roblox called require. And the way that it works is you give a local variable. In fact, let's call it helpers and change the name of our script to also be helpers, because that's kind of what we're going to be putting in this module script is a bunch of like little helpers that we can call from other scripts. So you create a new variable just like you would normally, and then you say request. Sorry, require. Require is the name of the keyword. So you require the given module script. And so now we need access to the server script service dot helpers. And the way that you get the server script service is the same way you get any other service. Get service with the name server script service, and then dot helpers is the name of our module script. So here we're saying my button script requires this module script to be able to run. So Roblox will see this and it will say, okay, I'll execute this script and return the module, and the module gets put into this helpers variable. Right? So now, instead of doing this to get the money, what we can do is say local money equals helpers dot get money and send in what I think is the owner. Or is it the player? They're probably the same thing in this case. Yeah. So now we still need that guard check that says if there's not money, then return early. But now instead of having two lots of if statements in here, we're just saying get money. And now we have one place to update how we get money. If we decide to change the word money to cash or whatever, we can do that here. And we won't need to update every single part of the script, other scripts that call it. So in a similar way, we can sort of call that now from our sellers script. So we can import that helper script by saying require the helper script. And now, instead of manually getting this money like we were doing before, we can say local money equals helpers dot get money. And who are we getting the money for? Well, in this case, it's the player. And if we don't have money for some reason it broke, then return early. So we're doing another guard condition here, which means we can get rid of all of this nonsense where we do sort of the inverse of the check. And we know at this point that we have money and it's ready and we can add 100 to it. And also, we don't really want to do any other logic up here that isn't part of a check. So let's get rid of that and put it right at the end. We destroy the product it got. Yeah. So that's cool. So what is this doing now? So in the seller, when something touches it, we check to make sure that the thing is a product. Then we sort of get the owner. So let's sort of rename this to owner ID. And we get the player from that, owner. But what we should be doing here, sorry, owner ID, I've copied the things all over the place. So we get the owner ID by looking at the owner attribute, and then we get the player from that owner ID. But what we didn't have here is a guard against there not being a player. For some reason, it went wrong and didn't work. We want to quit early. We don't want to assign money to like some half player that doesn't exist because it would throw an error. But now this looks neat, right? In this on-touch thing, you're doing all your checks first. And by the time you get down here, you're ready to sell the product. In this case, it gives you money and destroys the block. So that is pretty cool. I think all of these are nice and neat now in terms of these guard checks. So now this dropper also has a guard check. The buttons now have these nice guard checks at the top, and same with the sellers. So if you find, though, you have a bunch of code that you think you're going to repeat over and over again, we now have this module script where we can put that shared code in that people can use. So let me show you another example of doing that. I think as we add more mechanics, we're going to need to know if a thing that gets touched is being touched by the owner, right? I think we might need that. We might not, but it'll be cool if we had a nice function that does that check for us. So I'm going to take this code by cutting it, and I'm going to make a new function in here. So module call get owner equals a function. And I'll paste that code in there. And what I'd like to do then is pass in these various things that don't exist in here. So I'll say factory part is going to be a base part, and player part is going to be the base part that comes from the player. So really what this get owner function is going to do is going to take a part of the factory and find the owner of that factory, and it's going to make sure that the player that's associated with the player part you pass in is that owner, right? So maybe get owner is not a good name. Maybe check owner would be better. So we're going to get the player character from the player part's parent. And if it's not a player, then we return. Then we're going to get the owner ID from the factory part. And basically, we're going to say if the owner ID is not equal to the player user ID, oh, it doesn't know what that is, then return. Otherwise, return the player because that's the actual owner, right? We've validated that. So return nil in these places. So it's complaining because it doesn't know what the player's service is. So we can just add that to the top of our module script, right? So now it's going to get the character from this player part you pass in. And if it isn't a player for some reason, because it's an item that's dropped on the button or something, then return nil. But if it is, we find the owner of the factory, make sure that they match. If they do not match, we quit early. Otherwise, we're going to return that person. So I think we're going to have to call this in other places, but we'll see if I'm right later on. Right now, we're just going to call it from this one place. So the factory part, the part of the factory will be this button, and the part of the player is whatever touched us, right? And if we don't have an owner, if no owner, then return early. So we only call this in one place right now, but I suspect there's going to be other places that do something similar. Let's go ahead and head back to our Tycoon. And why don't we add something to this? Now that we've cleaned up the code, we can sort of use that clean code as a basis to add some more functionality. The first thing that I'd kind of like to fix is when you stand on one of these buttons, the button doesn't go away. And that's kind of annoying because it looks like you can buy it again, but we actually can't. So that's really easy though, because we have this nice clean code. We can come up here, and when you've bought the item and you've set the thing to true, we can just sort of destroy the button, right? That's super simple. And now if I was to walk over this button and buy it, it will get destroyed. So now I can't click it anymore. And of course, it doesn't get destroyed until I can buy it. So that's really easy to fix. And then another thing that we should do is I want to prove to you that this button can be used for a bunch of other stuff instead of just buying droppers. So let's do something really quick with our template. We can add a new part and remember to anchor it because we don't want it bouncing around all over the world. And what we're going to do is we're going to build up a couple of walls. So we'll change the scale. We'll drag it to this corner. We'll drag it to that corner. You know, I'm no building expert, so certainly take a little more time to do this than I am doing. But we can sort of build up a little wall here. Sorry, scale, no collision. One high. I mean, one wide, 5 high. How tall is a person? Not entirely sure. Duplicate that and add it to the other end. So this is a typical thing in Tycoons. Not only do you spend your hard-earned money on buying buttons that give you more money, but you also end up using it on more sort of cosmetic stuff like walls or maybe posters or crates hidden in the corner. And I just want to sort of prove to you that the current system is sort of expandable enough to be able to support that. So here we go. So we have now a wonderful set of walls that we will make look slightly different so we can tell. Why don't we make them cobblestone? Actually, I do not like cobblestone concrete. And we can sort of group these things up into a model. We'll name that model walls, and we'll put the walls inside the template. So now we have some walls, but we have no way of, we want a way of building the walls. So let's duplicate this button, any old button, and move it near part of the wall. Whoopsie. Move the button near the wall, not move the entire template. Oh my gosh, I didn't mean to move that either. Okay, move it near the wall and give it actually 100 is a fine name, fine cost. So that's fine, but we need to link it up to buying the wall. So we can go to the item to buy, and instead of it pointing to a dropper, it should be able to just point to a wall. And if we do that now, standing on that button should buy a wall. And because of the way our current code works, we don't actually need to change anything in terms of getting that working. There are a couple of problems. One, the label is dropper, and the cost is 0 because we didn't actually update it. And the other thing is the wall. I can still walk into the walls even though they're invisible. So let's just fix our system there. First thing is get that wall button, whichever one that was, and let's give it an actual cost. So walls cost, I don't know, 200. And instead of going and changing the name of this to walls, we're just going to go in our button script. And down here where we already sort of set the cost, why don't we just set the title of the item as well? So the title of the button should be the item to buy, that it's linked up to, but its name. So now we've already fixed a couple of those issues. One, the walls cost 200, and two, you can actually see that it's pointing to walls. So now we can add a button, whatever it's pointing to, that will be the name. So we can rename those things. So that's kind of handy because if I went and I changed, say, for example, this dropper here to be big dropper, right? Now playing the game, that script means that that button is going to buy a big dropper because that's the name of the thing that it's linked to. So that's cool. But let's fix the invisible walls. So the walls are invisible because our buttons, when they start up, find the associated item that you buy. It's not really a dropper anymore. And they hide them. Well, the other thing that we can sort of do is make that part can collide set to false. And then when you buy them, we can say part.canCollide equals true. So that's a really quick fix to now invisible walls you cannot walk into. And in fact, invisible droppers you used to be able to walk into, but now you can't, which is cool. And now if we do this and we earn $200, we should be able to buy those walls, which instead of doing anything with droppers, should just build that thing. So this proves to you that you can now use cosmetics sort of in your Tycoon too. So this is nice. This is wonderful. Yeah. So we could add like posters, we could add crates, and you could add all sorts of stuff to spend your money on. And it's really kind of easy. So that's one thing that we can do. The other thing I want to do is sort of improve the way that these droppers look. So not the droppers themselves, but the items that they drop. So right now, if you recall, in our dropper script, we generate a new product by creating a brand new part and sort of giving it a size and positioning it. But what if we wanted a cooler looking thing? So in your tycoon, you may not have um, a part like this that you want to sort of randomly generate. You might have used Blender or got a model from somewhere else that you want to use. And let me show you how we can do that in our current tycoon. So let's say we've got this thing from Blender that isn't a particular part. It's going to be a model, but I'm not going to show you how to use Blender today. So instead, we'll just make something that looks different to what is normally there. So we can have a part, and the other thing I'd like to sort of have on this part is a billboard GUI, right? And I don't want it to have a name though, so I'll just sort of delete that. I just want it to have a value, and we'll make that value look a bit different. Let's change it to a sort of yellowy text color. Okay, so now we have this part that has stuff built into it. And in fact, I'm just even going to group it as a model too, and call it product. So that you can see, even if you imported this from Blender, the same technique is going to work. And what I want to do is I basically want to create this when a part gets dropped, instead of from code instantiating a brand new block that looks completely different. So how do you do that? Well, what you can do is you can move this model into a place that doesn't really exist in the workspace, but you can still use it for cloning, very much like we did with the template being cloned onto those plots. So we can move it into this thing called server storage. And now it's no longer visible in the hierarchy because we don't really want it there until it's been made. But it is accessible by scripts on the server because it's inside server storage. And it's really easy to use one of these things. Much like we did in our factories where we clone something, we're going to do that. So inside our dropper, instead of instantiating a new part, we're going to get access to the server storage, which we can either do up here as like a global thing to this function, to this script, or we can do it inside that function itself. But let's do it up here. So server storage is get server storage. And then instead of that, instantiating a new part, we're going to say server storage.product clone. We're going to clone that product. And we're still going to give it the name drop. And we're not going to need the size anymore, but we are going to need the parent. And we don't even need to add this tag, actually, because we can add the tag directly to the thing that we're cloning. So that's nice. This isn't going to work, though, because it's a model. Models don't really have positions. Instead, we can use, similar to how we did with the template, pivot to, which will move the pivot point of the model to the pivot point of the drop. So that is a slightly different way because we're using models. They don't have positions. Parts do, though. How we can do that. So now, in theory, if I play this game now and I build something, we should see that it's going to drop, wow, our cool looking part, which is actually a model made of several different things, instead of the single block that we created. So you can imagine you'd spend some time making this look really cool in Blender. But you've noticed that they're piling up for some reason instead of being sold. And I think that's because in our seller, we're still assuming it was a part, not a model with a bit inside it. So the part is still going to be the thing that touches it. So now to get the model, we have to actually get the parent, right? So anywhere that we've used other part, we really need to do other part dot parent. That should then correctly get sold. So whenever you change your layout of items, you obviously need to update the code. But now it's working, and look how cool they look. Much better than our previous block, and we have this nice label that we can update. So let's, for example, these droppers currently have a mechanism for dropping that particular product, but I want to be able to specify the value of this stuff. So let's add a new attribute to our product and call it a value. And I'm going to set the value from this dropper. So drop.set value, set attribute, and the attribute is called value, to be equal to 100. So exactly like we're doing today. Sorry, you have to do it like this. You send it in. Set the attributes called value to be 100. And what we can do is whenever that value changes, we can update the label that we have on that drop, right? So we can say drop get attribute change signal. Now this is going to get us back the event that will get fired whenever an attribute change. And what attribute do we want to look for? Well, we want to know when the value changes. So that will give us an event that we can then connect to, where we write a function. And inside that, what we're going to do is go drop, which is that model dot. And then if we take a look, part. And then if we take a look in there, it's going to be the billboard GUI. And then in there, it's going to be the cost. And then in there, it's the text equals dollar dot dot to combine it with the value bit. And this is another thing where I don't want to end up like updating random bits of my hierarchy whenever I duplicate these things and add these things. I want it to dynamically update. And what this attribute change signal is doing is whenever this value gets set by any other piece of the code, it's going to update that cost for me because this event handler will trigger. So that means if I change the attribute to 10, for example, what we should see now is when this thing gets created and dropped, that label on it has automatically changed. How cool is that? And that's really good, but it's still giving us 100 money. So now in our sellers, what we can use is instead of 100, we can actually get the value of the drop from that attribute. So the way that we do that is the other part, which of course we've validated that it is the product, and that parent is the model. So the parent has that value attribute on it. So now if we played the game, not only do we have a cool looking part that drops from here, but we should earn a different amount of money now. And we do. Look, that's really cool. So we can update that as we go to whatever kind of value we want. Let's put it back up to 100 just so we don't have to wait ages to press our expensive buttons. Yeah, so that's a way that you can use cloning and the server storage to sort of make a nicer looking part for your Tycoon to use. So the reason that I wanted to actually add this attribute change handler because I want to update one of these droppers to no longer be a pure dropper. So instead, I'm going to stretch it out over here, and you probably know where I'm going with this because it's kind of a common theme inside these sorts of tycoons. I'm going to move this duplicated leg over here. And which part is the foot? Move this duplicated foot. Yeah, I actually think that's too big. So we need to scale it down a smidge. Move that then there. And this drop point is no longer going to be a drop point. It is instead going to be a scanner, I guess. And we're going to scale that to the size of this thing. And whoa, what happened there? And the size down is then going to stretch over here. And I don't want it so thick. Instead, it's going to be, well, that's the position. I want the size size is going to be 0.2. Oops. I mean, this is 0.2. The idea then being we make this partially transparent, like so, and we make it so you cannot collide with it. And we change its color to be something else, maybe a greeny yellow, greeny. I don't know, something like that. And you see, this is no longer a dropper. It is indeed an upgrader. Right, so let's get rid of the tag that says it's a dropper. And instead, we'll add a new one called upgrader. Now, this is cool because this is going to drop something. And now, if it passes through this scanner, we're going to make it worth more. So as an upgrader. So to do that, we're going to need a brand new script, but it's going to look a lot like some of these other ones. So add a new script, and we will rename it upgraders because that's what it's going to be controlling. And it's going to look a lot like the buttons, I think. So we're going to copy the buttons, paste it in upgraders, and we're going to rename some of these things. So we're going to have an upgrader model. Which is, of course, a model, but it doesn't have any of these pieces in. In fact, the only piece in there that's important to us is the scanner, which we know is a part. That's pretty good. The tag is going to be an upgrader. We'll rename this to be a list of upgraders. Similar with this, it's going to be an upgrader model, and this will be an upgrader. And on added will be an upgrader. Whoops, model. And this will be an upgrader model. There we go. Of course, you don't have any of these anymore. Upgrader, disconnect. And inside the untouched, though, we'll just sort of delete that part, which was the functionality. Rename this to be upgrader. Rename this to be the scanner, which is the part that the item is going to touch as it goes through. And then we'll sort of get rid of the thing in the touched event ready for us to write in there. So there we go. We have a nice upgrader script now, which is going to control all of our tagged upgraders, of which we only have one, but you imagine there's going to be more than one as we play a multiplayer game. Each factory will have one. So this script will control them all. And it, of course, works exactly the same as our buttons and our droppers and our sellers. It's using the collection service to get all those tagged things and make sure that we call these functions on it. When one goes into the world, we're going to add a touched event to the scanner. So what's supposed to happen when we scan this thing? Well, this works very similar to the seller. So the seller works by when a product touches it, the person gets money. Well, instead of doing that, when the product touches the upgrader, it's going to give the product more value, right? That sort of makes sense. So let's see. I just copied that from the seller script. Let's see what it's doing. So on touched event with the upgrader that was touched along with whatever touched it. So if the other part's parent, because we know it's a fancy model now, if the parent has the tag, if it doesn't have the tag product, then return early. Yep. Otherwise, we're going to get the owner of the upgrader and then make sure that we can find the player and they haven't left or something. And as long as that's valid, we'll be here. And so instead of getting the money and adding the value of the product to the money, we won't do that. Instead, we'll be increasing the value of the product, right? Because it's an upgrader, so it's going to upgrade the value of the product. And what we'll do is we'll set that to the current value times 2. We'll just say that for now. And how do we get the current value? Well, we know this other part is the product, so we can say get the attribute value, right? So that's the current price of it, I guess, the value of it. And then it's going to upgrade it by setting that value to be twice as much. So I think this should work in theory, but as usual, let's try it out and see what happens. So now, first thing you'll notice is this button is already saying upgrader because we renamed the thing that it's linked to. And oh, that is cool. It is working. You see it's passing where the upgrader should be, and it is upgrading it. So look, it is working. The problem is we clearly haven't bought the upgrader yet. So you know why that is? Is because very similar to the dropper, we have not checked that the item was purchased before it does all the touching script. So we can add that guard clause at the beginning of this and say, if the upgrader has not been purchased, then just quit early. So that will be the first check that it makes. But we actually saw it sort of work before we bought it. So I'm pretty confident that this should work. Let's see if my confidence pays off. So we're going to have 300 money, and we should be able to buy this now. And there's our fun-looking scanner. Oh dear. My confidence was unfounded. It appears that this is no longer letting items through. And I sort of know why that is, because if you remember in the button script, when we purchase something, what we did is we set the can collide back to true. Because when we hid it originally, we said, okay, don't collide with it while it's hidden. Now, the problem is we don't want to, most of the time, you do want to make it collidable once you turn it visible. The problem is for this particular part, the scanner part, we never want that to be, collidable, right? So there are many ways to do this. We could do something fancy to sort of record the state of all these things and then compare that. We could do that. Or we could just do something a bit more simple, which will work for us here. So in the scanner part, we'll just add a new tag and we'll say always non-collidable. Is that how you spell it? Maybe not, but you get the idea. So we'll add a tag that says always non-collidable. And then in here, as we're looping through the parts to make them collidable, we'll just do a check here. So we'll say if part has tag always non-collidable, then return. Right? So we'll make it visible, but if it's always non-collidable, then we won't bother setting it to collidable true. So it will remain not collidable. And so anything you want that to happen to, you can add that tag to, which is fine. We could have done it another way, more complicated way, and we would have not had to add tags, but I think this is pretty straightforward. The problem is I've returned from inside a loop instead of continuing. So if you're inside a loop and you use return, it doesn't return out of that loop, unfortunately. It returns out of whatever function you're in. So it's going to return out of this thing, which means we're going to skip all the other things that were after that part. So instead, you've got two options. If you want to break out of the loop, so quit the loop, but carry on in the function, you can use break. But we actually want to just skip the rest of this loop and go to the next iteration of the loop. And so the keyword for that is continue. So that will skip this part of the loop and go back up to here when that happens. So we'll continue showing the rest of the parts. So there we go. Now I'm 99% confident that this will work. There's always that 1% where you never know what's going to happen, but I think we should be good. So that's going to give us 300 money. Then we can stand on this, and hopefully the part passes through. Yay, and now it's worth 200. You see, so now we have a dropper, we have an upgrader, and we have this thing called a big dropper, but that just happens to drop the exact same thing. But you could update it, right? We could, and again, there are many ways to do this, but we could change our big dropper to have a tag, or we could make all droppers have an attribute that's like the worth of their starting item that they drop, and you could sort of add it here instead of hard coded to 100. You could just set that. So why don't I just do that and show you what I mean? So we'll select all of our droppers, and I think we have 3. We'll add attributes of that, and we'll say drop value. We'll set it to a number. We'll set that initially to 100. So we can then in here say the dropper get attribute drop value, and that will be the value that we initially give to whatever gets generated by the dropper. And so our big dropper can use, something like 400, something bigger. So now with just a few simple changes, we've got a more compelling Tycoon. So we have the ability to drop cool looking models that sort of have their price on them. That price will be dynamically updated, the label, whenever we change the actual value of the item. So you see it's dynamically updated, but all we did was change the value of that drop in the code. And now when we have this big dropper, it should, in theory, drop something worth a lot more because it's a big dropper. So there you go. And now this is already a much more exciting Tycoon, although it's not perfect. But you can, of course, use these techniques now in your own game to make a more exciting dropper. You've seen how we can upgrade values and change things, make cosmetics like this wall. And get it all working. But we do have to fix this. That error is saying, although I accidentally deleted it, it's basically saying that this parent value is nil. So I researched why it was doing that, which is why the video sort of cut out. And it turns out that when you destroy something as part of a touched event, well, it turns out that that touched event may have already triggered several times. And so what's sort of happened is in the same frame, the physics engine has detected 2 collisions. Maybe the cube sort of slid along a little bit and it made 2 collisions and they happened in the same frame. So these 2 touch events fired twice. You can think of them firing one after the other. And so the first one comes in and we say, okay, get the parent. Is it a product? Yep, that's fine. Do all this good stuff. And then we destroy it. And then in that same frame, it had already queued up the second touch event as it skidded along. And so we come back in here from the second touch event and we've already destroyed this other part. So the parent is already set to null. So really the best way of just preventing this is checking that the parent exists. So if there is not a parent, then just like our other sort of guard conditions, we can get rid of it. Because if there's no parent, we can't do anything with this item anyway. And that will sort of prevent a second touched event from coming in that we then sort of try and handle. And we use this same pattern in the button too. You see, we sort of destroy it at the end. So it's possible that you can sort of walk on it fast enough that 2 collisions happen in the same frame. So it's best to guard against that here too. I don't think the other scripts have touched events. Maybe the upgrader does, but we don't destroy it. So it's probably fine that we don't have it. But you know what? Because we're checking dot parent, we're better safe than sorry. So it's better just checking this and quitting early if an unexpected thing happens than to let all the script errors like pile up in the log. So that now should be fixed. And we will take a look next time. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.